All right, let's dive into this massive thing, the U.S. federal budget. You've been hearing about DOGE a lot lately.
Yeah.
With Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Right.
Talking about really shaking things up with how the government spends money.
Exactly.
And guess what? We're using the actual financial report of the U.S. government for fiscal year 2023.
Oh, wow.
So we're not messing around here.
That's great.
Yeah.
This is exciting because it's not just theoretical cuts.
Really?
We're talking about real programs,
Yeah.
real impacts. And the scale is just mind-boggling. I mean, think about
It's huge.
a stack of dollar bills reaching the moon.
Wow.
That's the kind of money we're dealing with here.
Okay, so if we handed Elon and Vivek the budget scissors,
Yeah.
where would they likely start snipping? Let's be honest, when we talk about potential cuts,
Right.
social insurance programs like Social Security and Medicare are often the elephants in the room.
Exactly right. And the report actually highlights a projected shortfall of $78.4 trillion
Oh, wow.
over the next 75 years. Now, the interesting thing is this is calculated using something called present value,
Right.
which basically translates those future costs into today's dollars.
So DOGE proponents
Yeah.
who are all about efficiency
Right.
and often, skeptical of these long-term projections
Yeah.
might question the validity of that number altogether.
Right.
But even if we take it at face value, the question becomes, where do you even begin to trim a number that big?
Yeah, that's a great question. One recurring theme with DRGE is this idea of individual responsibility.
Okay.
So they might look at raising the retirement age,
Okay.
Yeah, people are living longer, the argument goes.
Right.
So maybe we need to adjust when those benefits kick in.
But wouldn't that disproportionately impact people in
Oh, absolutely.
physically demanding jobs
Yeah.
who might not be able to work as long? That seems to contradict the idea of fairness that often comes up in these discussions.
Absolutely. And that's a tension that DOGE often grapples with, that individual responsibility
Right.
versus ensuring everyone has a fair shot.
Yeah.
They might counter by suggesting that those specific cases could be handled through maybe some more targeted programs rather than a broad brush approach.
Okay, so maybe they'd argue for more fine-tuning instead of these sweeping changes.
Right.
What about adjusting benefits based on income?
Okay.
Give more to those who need it most,
Yeah.
less to those who are more well off.
That definitely aligns with their focus on targeted solutions.
Right.
But it also opens up a whole can of worms about means testing, bureaucracy,
Yeah.
and potentially discouraging people from saving if they know they'll get a bigger benefit later.
All right, it gets messy fast.
Yeah, it does.
And of course, the perennial solution is just raising payroll taxes.
Right.
More money coming in means you can theoretically cover those shortfalls. But that flies in the face of DOGE's general dislike for tax increases, right?
Exactly. They'd likely argue that that higher taxes just stifle economic growth,
Right.
which ultimately hurts everyone. So they'd probably push for finding savings elsewhere before resorting to raising taxes.
All right, so social insurance is clearly a tough nut to crack, even with the DOGE lens.
Absolutely.
Let's shift gears to something a little more explosive.
Okay.
Defense spending.
All right.
The report mentions that the Department of Defense owns a whopping 67.4% of the government's property, plant, and equipment.
Wow.
We're talking $1.2 trillion worth of stuff.
And, DOGE is all about limited government.
Right.
So they would likely scrutinize those massive military assets.
Yeah.
One obvious target would be overseas bases and deployments.
Okay.
Do we really need to be everywhere all at the same time?
That's a classic America First argument. But wouldn't pulling back create risks? Power vacuums, emboldened adversaries, strained alliances, it seems like that could actually cost more in the long run.
That's definitely the counter-argument for sure. And DOGE isn't necessarily isolationist, so they might argue for more strategic deployments, focusing on key partnerships rather than trying to be the world's policeman.
Okay, so smarter spending, not necessarily less spending.
Right.
What about streamlining procurement? Those infamous stories about overpriced toilet seats and hammers.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right up their alley. DOGE hates inefficiency.
Right.
And loves market-based solutions. They'd likely push for more competition and defense contracting.
Okay.
Breaking up those cozy relationships that can drive up costs.
But isn't there a risk that cutting corners on military equipment
Sure.
could compromise safety or effectiveness?
That's a valid concern, and one that DOGE would need to address head on. They might counter by saying that with the right incentives and oversight, the private sector can deliver high-quality goods at a lower cost.
So it's a gamble, but one they might be willing to take. And what about investing in new technologies? Drones, AI, cyber warfare. Wouldn't that align with their focus on innovation?
Absolutely, especially if it means, potentially needing fewer boots on the ground in the long run.
Right, yeah.
But this is where that skepticism of long-term projections might kick in again.
Right, these are cutting-edge technologies with, unknown costs and unpredictable outcomes.
Yeah.
And DOGE tends to favor those, short-term, tangible results.
Yeah, they might argue that the potential payoffs are too great to ignore, especially in such a rapidly changing world.
Right.
But it's definitely a tension within their philosophy.
All right, so we've tackled social insurance and defense, two areas where DOGE would likely make some waves.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to this budget beast.
Oh, there is.
Let's not forget education, a sector where DOGE's emphasis on individual choice and market-based solutions could lead to some radical shifts.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now we're getting into some really interesting territory. But before we dive into that, let's take a quick breather.
Okay.
And let our listeners absorb all this budgetary goodness. We'll be right back to unpack education and more in part 2 of our DOGE Deep Dive.
Sounds good. Welcome back. Before the break, we were about to wade into the world of education spending through a DOGE-colored lens, and things could get interesting here.
Okay, so we've got Elon and Vivek looking at the education budget. What's their first move?
Well, remember, they're big on individual empowerment and market forces, right?
Right.
So they might start by pushing for more school choice, charter schools, vouchers, the whole shebang.
So basically giving parents more control over where their kids go to school instead of being stuck in that traditional public school system.
Exactly. They would argue that competition would breed innovation and drive up quality, just like in the private sector.
But wouldn't that also risk creating a system where the best schools are only accessible to those who can afford them? What about kids in underprivileged areas?
That's a valid concern, and one that they'd need to address. They might argue for a system where funding follows the student, giving those in disadvantaged areas more options.
Okay, so maybe like a voucher system where the amount varies based on need?
Right.
That could get complicated fast, though.
It would definitely require careful design and oversight.
Yeah.
But remember, DOGE isn't about just throwing money at problems.
Right.
It's about finding the most efficient and effective solutions.
All right, so school choice is one area where they'd likely shake things up. What about higher education?
Okay.
College costs are through the roof these days.
This is where their skepticism of government intervention might really come into play.
Okay.
They could argue that federal student loans and subsidies have actually inflated tuition costs by creating this artificial demand.
So instead of helping students afford college, the government's actually making it more expensive. That's a pretty bold claim.
It's a controversial one for sure.
Yeah.
They might point to data showing that tuition increases have outpaced inflation.
Right.
Suggesting that something isn't working quite right.
Okay, let's say they're right. What's the DOGE solution to runaway college costs?
They might advocate for a more market-based approach, things like income share agreements, where students pay back a percentage of their future earnings instead of taking on those traditional loans.
So kind of like investing in human capital.
Right.
Interesting idea.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that discourage people from pursuing those lower paying but, socially valuable careers?
That's a potential downside.
Yeah.
And one that DOGE proponents would need to address. They might argue for some targeted programs to support those fields, or that a more vibrant economy overall would just lead to higher wages across the board.
Right. So education's another area where DOGE would bring some radical ideas to the table. Let's move on to a topic that's been heating up the political landscape lately, climate change.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Because DOGE's emphasis on limited government and free markets kind of bumps up against the need for this collective action on a global scale.
Right. Climate change doesn't respect national borders, so you can't just go it alone.
Exactly. So how do you reconcile a philosophy that's skeptical of government intervention with a problem that arguably requires it?
I'm guessing Elon and Vivek have some thoughts on this.
They might argue that the best way to address climate change is through innovation and technological breakthroughs
Okay.
driven by the private sector.
So basically letting the free market work its magic and come up with clean energy solutions.
That's the idea. They might point to the progress already being made in areas like solar and wind power
Right.
and argue that government regulations and subsidies are actually hindering that progress.
But what about the urgency of the problem? Scientists are saying we need to act now to avoid those, catastrophic consequences.
Right.
Can we really afford to wait for the market to solve this?
That's the counter argument, of course.
Yeah.
And some DOGE proponents might actually support a carbon tax. Putting a price on pollution
Right.
to incentivize businesses and individuals to reduce their emissions.
Wait, a tax? Didn't we say they're generally against tax increases?
They might argue that a carbon tax is different
Okay.
because it's a market-based solution that corrects a market failure.
Right.
The fact that polluters aren't paying the full cost of their actions.
Okay, so it's a bit of a compromise.
Right.
Using government intervention to nudge the market in the right direction.
Exactly. And they might also argue that the revenue generated from a carbon tax could be used to offset other taxes, making it more palatable to businesses and consumers.
All right, so there's some nuance to their approach on climate change.
Yeah.
What about the more general issue of waste and inefficiency in government?
This is where DOGE's principles really shine. They'd be all about streamlining processes, cutting bureaucracy, and using technology to make government more efficient and accountable.
So less red tape, more results.
Exactly.
Sounds good in theory, but how would they actually implement that?
They might push for things like zero-based budgeting, where agencies have to justify every dollar they spend instead of just getting those automatic increases.
So making them prove their worth, basically.
Exactly. And they'd likely be big on using data analytics to track spending, identify areas for improvement, and hold people accountable.
Okay, so less guesswork, more evidence-based decision-making. That seems like a no-brainer.
It does. But it requires a culture shift within government, a willingness to embrace change and challenge the status quo.
Right, because bureaucracy is kind of like a comfortable old shoe. It might be a bit worn out, but it's familiar.
Exactly. And changing that mindset wouldn't be easy.
Yeah.
But DOGE proponents would argue that the potential for savings and improved services is worth the effort.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from social insurance and defense to education, climate change, and the ever-present issue of waste and inefficiency.
It's clear that applying DOGE principles to the federal budget would lead to some significant changes with both potential benefits and risks.
And it's important to remember that this is just one perspective on a very complex issue.
Absolutely.
There are many other viewpoints out there.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide what they believe is the best way forward.
Absolutely. But, exploring these different perspectives can help us all think more critically about the choices we face as a society.
Right.
And that's what the deep dive is all about.
We've analyzed the potential impact of DOGE on various aspects of the federal budget, from social programs and defense to education and climate change. We've explored the potential benefits and drawbacks of this approach, highlighting the need for careful consideration and a nuanced perspective. Now let's shift gears and address the elephant in the room. The $78.4 trillion shortfall in social insurance programs. This raises a critical question. How do we balance fiscal responsibility with ensuring a safety net for those who rely on these programs?
Yeah, that shortfall is a big one. And, as we've been exploring these DOGE ideas, it's striking how much they push us to rethink the very role of government.
It really is. It's a fundamental shift. DOGE is all about empowering individuals, right?
Right.
So they likely argue that the government's role should be more limited, focusing on essential functions like national defense, protecting individual rights.
But what about those who need a safety net?
Yeah.
Social Security, Medicare. These programs are lifelines for millions of Americans. This is where that tension between individual responsibility and collective action comes into play again.
Right.
DOGE proponents might argue for a more targeted approach to social safety net programs, focusing on those who truly need help.
So maybe means testing benefits, making sure they go to those who are most vulnerable. That seems to align with their emphasis on efficiency.
Exactly. They might also push for reforms that encourage personal savings and investment, shifting some of the burden away from the government.
But wouldn't that exacerbate existing inequalities?
Yeah.
Those who are already struggling might not have the resources to save or invest effectively.
That's a valid concern, and one that DOGE would need to address. They might argue for things like financial literacy programs
Okay.
or incentives to encourage savings, trying to level the playing field.
Okay, so it's a balancing act trying to promote individual responsibility
Right.
while also ensuring that everyone has a fair shot. It's not an easy problem to solve.
No, it's not. And it requires a nuanced approach.
Yeah.
One that considers the complexities of human behavior
Right.
and the realities of economic inequality.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into DOGE and the federal budget,
Yeah.
what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that DOGE represents a significant departure from the way we've traditionally thought about government.
Right.
You know, it's a philosophy that challenges us to reconsider that balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility.
Right. It's not just about cutting spending for the sake of cutting spending.
Exactly.
It's about redefining the role of government in a way that aligns with their core principles.
And those principles are rooted in a belief in the power of individuals and markets to solve problems.
Right.
Whether you agree with that philosophy or not, it's important to understand its implications.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, applying DOGE principles to the federal budget would have far-reaching consequences, impacting everything from social programs and defense to education and climate change.
Yeah. So as you continue to explore these ideas, I encourage you to think critically about the trade-offs involved.
Yeah.
Consider your own values and priorities and ask yourself, what kind of society do we want to create?
What role do we want government to play in our lives?
Right.
These are big questions, but they're essential ones.
They are.
And engaging in these conversations is crucial for shaping a future that works for everyone.
Remember, the federal budget isn't just a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet.
Right.
It's a reflection of our values, our priorities,
Yeah.
and our vision for the future.
And ultimately, it's up to all of us to decide what that future looks like. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into DOGE and the federal budget.